I want to get into my I guess sort of core of why we're talking about, decentralized decentralized finance, decentralized applications more generally, which is the implications for governance. So where do I want to start? Because you could start almost anywhere with this. In a way, the ambition of Bitcoin, regardless of whether or not it will ultimately be realized, if you think that Bitcoin will be a world currency, maybe if you think it will just exist in a pool among many other currencies, that's probably, I'd say, the scenario that I think is most likely at this point. But Bitcoin could reign supreme. It could be the most valuable currency. I just don't think it'll be the only one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the narrative is it's gold 2.0, and
Yes.
it's the only contender for that narrative, and maybe it wins.
Yeah. So, in terms of the design space that Satoshi Nakamoto was working in, he actually crafted something very tight, despite whatever its flaws might be. That is actually hard to improve upon, I'd say, in terms of its core functionality. That being said, I don't mean as a medium for exchange necessarily. That being said, one of the core aspects of Bitcoin that I think you can come around to more readily if you understand the Ethereum architecture is that it's outsourcing a particular function of the state, right? So the state establishes the monetary system, it prints money, it determines as part of its sovereign charter what the valid unit of exchange or currency is going to be within its domain. And then through various kinds of monetary policy, it can manipulate and arbitrage that currency and also change the way in which it interfaces with other currencies. And so there's all kinds of scheming that goes on within the global financial system between currencies and manipulation and different kinds of trades that you can do to kind of leech, I guess arbitrage between the sort of patchwork of established currencies that exist. And when you take that decentralized component as an operation of the state and you extend that out with something like Ethereum, which allows, a Turing complete computation network, you then start to realize that there are many other operations of the state that could also be outsourced or reformatted in this decentralized way. And so how do you think about the implications of decentralization? Let's say decentralization, I'm not even sure what word to use because I would use blockchain, but like it's sort of more than blockchain at this point. Decentralized technologies. How do you think about the implications of decentralized technologies for our current governance structures that exist? And I'll let you just go off that.
Yeah, so I mean, initially I was very bullish on the idea of like the DAO or the decentralized autonomous or anonymous organization. Pick your A. But I think in thinking about it a lot more, it's definitely not a silver bullet. Like, I don't think that just because you decentralize government, all of a sudden government doesn't become good. And you run into like the advantage of a human government is that you can kind of be a little loose with your rules. You can be flexible on them. You're not rigid in like the rules. Like these rules are definitely immutable and these rules are mutable in these ways. Like everything's a little bit fuzzy and everything, if you push on it hard enough, like there's no magic to the law. Like I'm a fan of this kind of idea of legal realism, which is like, you on the one hand you have what's written, but the law is actually what the legal actors in the system carry out. Like, what do the judges actually do? What do the police actually, who are they actually listening to? Who is the army actually listening to? Like, that's what the law is. And so on the one hand, like, okay, so you could say we have this like smart contract based legal system, But to the extent that we want that legal system to actually have an impact on our physical world, right? It still comes down to, are people actually respecting what's being said? Okay, the contract spits out, attack country B, but like, are they going to do it? Are they going to listen? Like, that's still important. So, contracts can kind of have like absolute sovereignty over things in the digital realm, over things that live in, the virtual machine that is kind of Ethereum, right?
Mhm.
So a classic example of like an easy system to build is you could have a will, right? And you could have this, you put money in here and you say, hey, if I don't check in with you every year, distribute the money to these 4 people, right? Or you could make it a governance system where you could allow, say, 3 people to check in. And or you could have them manipulate, like, oh, well, this person's allowed to vote that actually, like, we don't like her, she gets 10% less or something. So you have the problem of enforceability. Like, in the smart contract world, smart contracts can have things that exist in the sort of computer. And then you get to this other problem of kind of like oracles, where are you actually getting the information from? You could have this sort of decentralized betting network where you allow people to vote, to place bets on who's going to be the next president, but it's like, well, who tells it who actually won? Someone has to do it. Someone has to be.
So do you mind just for the listeners, telling the audience a little bit about what an oracle is exactly?
So an oracle is a term used in crypto DeFi stuff a lot, which is referring to basically your information source. Like, for something that needs to be told, kind of like this, who won the election, right? Like, the blockchain has no knowledge of that. It has to be told it externally. Or if you wanted to have a will that actually looked at, the death records of a county, like the county would be the oracle in that case. So you can get clever and you can kind of construct systems that don't rely on an oracle, right? So on the one hand, you could look at the death records of the county. On the other hand, you could do kind of like a dead man switch, proof of life thing, where it's like, as long as I check in, assume I'm alive. If I don't check in for some period of time, assume I'm dead, right? That system doesn't require an oracle. But so you get into these governance problems, and then very quickly, like, you arrive at needs for oracles all over the place. So a big problem in crypto is like, how do you actually, come up with reputable oracles? And I think there's some interesting, I think as the crypto space matures, you get into these, you start being able to like use crypto systems as oracles themselves, right? So for instance, if you wanted to have a like an option trading system, right? And you need to know like the price of the underlying asset to be able to make the option contract work. You can actually use a decentralized exchange as your pricing source, right? So that's kind of cool. So like, your decentralized exchange becomes your oracle. So you can do those two things. But so for starters, in the world of governance, right, you have this oracle problem, which is very hard to get away from. And then you have this like, well, at the end of the day, you're relying on the actors in the system to actually enforce the rules. So like, I don't really think you can get away from either of those problems.
Yeah.
But then,
well, anyway, I was going to say, like, yeah, there is this issue of like, you're not really ever going to automate the entire thing. There still has to be this human component. There still have to be humans participating in the network in order to continue feeding it data, in order to update it properly. And so there are certain things you can verify the veracity of, but you're not necessarily going to eliminate that human component. And I think that's where you run into like some of the limitations for example, what many of us would have thought that DAOs might bring. And maybe they'll eventually get there. But for right now, there's still a lot of like, there's still a lot of like fuzziness, I guess, around what exactly is possible and what's viable. to prepare for this, and also just for my own investigations, I've looked into some of the applications that are currently in place in governments, how they have tried to use blockchain technologies, mostly blockchain technologies, to, run their operations differently. I'd say the most prominent example of this would be Estonia. So Estonia was very early in the crypto space. They even claimed that they were building out blockchains before Bitcoin was released, which is curious, but in like 2007. But Estonia has actually, basically just added huge chunks of their government onto blockchain systems, right? Instead of central, and the basic innovation here isn't too crazy. They just, instead of having these centralized databases, they have a decentralized database for things like voting and banking and various aspects of citizenship verification. For example, you can become a digital citizen of Estonia even if you don't live there. I'm not aware of any other country that allows you to do that, or what exactly that means, but it does entitle you to some benefits and so forth that operating within the Estonian governmental ecosystem. That really calls into question, like, for example, like, why am I still going to the DMV? like
Well,
I don't
that's a
know.
great question. I mean, we don't need decentralized technology to solve those problems, right? That's just
Yeah.
like run-of-the-mill government dysfunction.
Well,
But
there is some added benefit to security and transparency. So, for example, one of the arguments, you're correct that you have to not get carried away and just say, oh, well, we're just gonna like throw it on a blockchain and we don't really have a reason for it. We just think it'll be better because it's like using that buzzword or something.
mhm,
There are reasons for doing so. One of which, for example, is that if you make for example, in their medical system, if you make a change to a medical record, there's no way for someone to go in and tamper that medical record or remove it or change it in some way. And so it actually does limit the abuse of governmental powers in that sense.
that's true. I
Because,
mean,
yeah.
it creates a new class of issue too. Like, for instance, say you have like a property titling for a county is done on the blockchain, right?
Mhm.
And so when you buy a house, what you're actually buying is the private key to that, ledger entry in the sort of like property registry that the county maintains. Okay.
Yeah.
And, in cryptocurrencies, when you lose your private key, you're screwed, right? Your crypto's gone. Okay. If you lose your private key, do you lose your house? And okay, maybe you can create a new system where it's like, okay, but actually if a sufficient number of your neighbors vote that you actually control that house, then you get your key back, right? And we have a smart contract that generates it. So you can avoid abuses by sort of the small town clerk like redrawing property lines for bribes, but you also get this whole new class of issue. Like what if I do want to change something? What if someone forgets something? What if someone entered data incorrectly? Like, how do we fix those problems? And those are hard to do, and they require a lot of work to actually think through, right? You can have these sort of like proof of neighbor ideas, but those are well, and those could be cool, right? It could force you to have good relationships with your neighbors,
Mhm.
and that could incentivize good behavior. Yeah, and I think some of the purest models for thinking about like what could decentralized government look like is like these big new crypto projects where they're truly decentralized organizations and they truly have voting power from the token holders, and they're really controlling billions of dollars. So if someone can abuse their governance system, they just lost billions of dollars, right? So that's like a pretty good incentive to get it right.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I was going to say, on a meta level, one of the most appealing things about the entire crypto space is that a tremendous amount of the problems that they're tasked with solving at various communities are these kinds of problems. How do you build community? How do you, like, they're solving basic governance problems, and I don't mean governance in the term in the sense of government. I mean, governance in the term, in the sense of how do you coordinate together? How do you decide upon common rules? How do you, organize processes within this system that are, like you said, going to prevent abuse, going to secure the system, going to provide some amount of equity for participants, et cetera. A tremendous amount of energy goes into just simply designing these systems and setting them up the right way, and then also iterating on them, finding out, okay, what were the problems with the way that we set this one up? How could we set this up differently next time? Or how do we actually, through the processes that we've already created, how do we try to like go back and manipulate it, whether that's forking or something less drastic, to figure that out. And so that's actually one of the biggest appeals to me, is that they're actually solving all of these like core governance problems that you would think about, for example, if you were setting up a new country, right? If you were setting up a new country and let's say you have like an initial starting population and an initial treasury, you would have to like build out an entire system for how everything would be distributed and also how everything would be governed. And I see that's what's happening in the virtual space inside of these communities, and that's really what's exciting about it to me. And I guess one last thing I'll say on this is that you know, the history of like constitutional republics is based on this concept of a social contract, right? So we have social contract theory, and even though none of us signed the U.S. Constitution, we are in effect bound to this social contract that exists. And in principle, we've talked a little bit about how maybe some of this stuff is actually difficult to implement in a real sense, but in principle, there's no reason for having the rules of your government laid out on a 300-year-old piece of paper, right?
Yeah.
And you could have something like a constitution that is in the form of a smart contract. Now, again, it's unclear exactly how that would all be implemented, how you would verify that the rules are being followed, et cetera, et cetera. There's going to be all kinds of room for discretion on the part of, voting members and judges and whatnot, because at some point you have to interface with the real human world. But this is like the core idea that I wanted to get around to, which is that if you have a community of people and you have a common currency and you have a set of rules that they follow, then you pretty much have a country, with the only difference being that there's not a recognition of sovereignty and they don't control like a piece of physical land.